Hi all. So this talk is called The Layers of an Onion. When you're building for the web, at least in the beginning, it's helpful to think about the layers of a website as layers, much like the layers in an onion, right? So essentially what we're working with is everything from the core of the networked computer, which is sort of like the middle of the onion, all the way out to essentially the brain of our users, right? So that being sort of the outer layer of the onion. So if you start to peel away from the outside of the onion, eventually you get down to the core of the computer, right? The core, the middle of the onion. One of the readings for this week is chapter 3 in the text. It's kind of a breakdown of how this layered onion metaphor works. So be sure to take a look at that chapter this week and read through that. Let me know if you have any questions. So we'll dive deep into this idea, and I think at the end you'll have a pretty good idea. And it's a good sort of model to keep in mind. When you start to interact with websites, you think about the code that's behind that main interface there. You think about the different layers of code that are involved in creating an interactive, a rich web experience. I've had questions in the past of, how do bigger websites like Amazon, for example, work? And so we'll talk about these sort of deeper layers of code that come into play in different kinds of websites. All right, so afterwards, if you have any questions, let me know, and let's take a look. All right, so let's take a look at this in an organized fashion. We're going to look at the different types of code here in one column. We're also going to look at examples of those types of code, or the popular languages that we see in use quite often. And then we'll also have these sort of horizontally stacked up in relation to this sort of onion layer that we're talking about, where the computer is the center of the computer, the center of the network computer is at the center of the onion, and then as we work our way out, we're working our way out more towards the web developer and ultimately the user of the web work that you're building, whether you're building a responsive website or maybe a mobile app or really anything. These layers sort of apply across the board when we're talking about computer languages, right? So at the lowest level, what we're looking at is something called machine code. So in this class, be sure that you don't get intimidated. We're certainly not going to be writing any machine code, but this introductory talk is in place to make sure that you have a little bit of a context and a way of sort of visualizing how these layers of code interact. Aside from all the hardware and electricity, most of what allows a computer to function, that is to communicate with itself and ultimately other computers, is code. At the very center of the onion, a computer's central processing unit functions with what we call machine code. This is the binary system of symbols made up of strings of ones and zeros that are organized in sets of 8 that humans have a tough time making sense of. This works well for the machines, however, because it is binary and it's relatively lightweight, and it's also extremely efficient for machines to work with, to write, to compile, to communicate through, so on and so forth. On top of the machine code, the next layer of the onion skin is called an assembly language, or the assembly languages. This is the computer language that humans can read and write and make sense of, which communicates with the computer's machine code that is located one layer below. The assembly languages communicate with the machine code, often using compilers and linkers, depending on the type of language. The assembly language, in turn, works with other programming languages, such as C, for example, to create what we call the lower-level languages. These layers form a sort of nerve center of the computational device. There is a lot of interaction going on between human and computer at this level, but as you can imagine, and more often than not, it's in the form of programming. So as you can see, we're starting to get this foundation of code, basically, that makes up this stack, this system of layers from the machine code up to the assembly language, up to these lower level languages that really create the core of any computer, any computational device. All right, so let's keep building our tower of languages here, our tower of code. The next layer of our onion or of our tower here comes in the form of what are called, what you might have guessed, are the higher level languages. Largely, it is in this higher level that we can program and build websites and web applications, with which the users of our products can interact in an uncountable number of ways. It is in this higher level language layer that we find computer languages that are more common, that we hear rather often in the web world, languages such as C++, Objective-C, Java, C#, VB.NET, Ruby, Python, PHP, JavaScript, ActionScript, on and on. It's a long list. These are called object-oriented languages, and they tend to be relied on for the heavy lifting that may need to be included in an interactive environment. Interactive design and development usually includes relational or other types of databases that store the information a user is interacting with. At this level, it is important to consider how the programs will interact with and use raw and formatted data. So it's worth mentioning here, although it's outside of the scope of IST 250, it will be within the scope of IST 251. When you're talking about websites that use databases, sites and apps that interact with stored data, largely, usually, oftentimes anyway, in what we call relational databases. There is another language that is worth mentioning here called SQL or SQL, kind of goes by both names. This is a language that allows a website, a bunch of files on a server that make up a site, to interact with these databases. And it's actually a fairly simple language. So it is a language in its own right, and is worth mentioning here. So it's somewhat of a go-between, between say a web form on a website, any part of a website that would be using, or storing data, either sending data to a database or pulling data from a database. It could be updating and editing data in a database. Countless uses for databases and websites to interact. But you wouldn't use SQL unless you were interacting with data in a database. So I just wanted to mention that at this point. We don't talk about it in IST 250, but it is worth mentioning. And then, of course, if you're interested in more robust, dynamic, data-driven websites and apps, websites in particular, you might want to look into a new class that we're working on, which I mentioned, which is IST 251. So in that class we use a lot of different technologies, but mainly PHP, which is listed here as one of the higher level languages, and it interacts with SQL, which then interacts with the database. So just something I wanted to mention at this point. Okay, so let's keep moving on. Further out, we have another layer to our onion, our growing tower here of code that includes lighter weight languages, some may say. Many of the languages in this layer are called markup languages. Markup languages such as HTML5, XML, CFML, which is the Cold Fusion markup language. These are used mainly for structure, communication, and display of data. HTML, the hypertext markup language, is a standard for pages on the World Wide Web, as you may already be aware. For our purposes, we can consider the standard web styling language known as cascading style sheets, or by its initials CSS, to be included in this layer of the computer-based web system. So oftentimes when we're talking about fairly simple HTML-based websites, or also called static HTML sites, meaning that they're websites that are not interacting with a database, we sort of by default include CSS in that conversation because it's really become the standard, the norm for styling your HTML. So for anything above and beyond just extremely basic text on a page or on a screen, you're going to want to learn a little bit of CSS and brush up on your CSS skills. So we'll be doing that later on in the semester. But we include CSS in this layer as well. When considering a website or a native mobile app, this layer plays a major role in the user interface engineering of the product. None of the layers really ever does much on their own, any of these layers that we're looking at right now. These layers continually work together to make happen what we tell the computer we would like it to do. So if the computer or mobile device is our metaphorical onion, then it is possible that this is where our metaphor ends, especially if we're strictly talking about code here. However, you might do well to sort of keep an open mind about it. For purposes of continuing the illustration, we may consider the next layer out to be where we start to see humans really interacting with the computer that is running the product we built. So this is when we start talking about our users and how our users are interacting with the websites that we're building. You may have heard the term usability testing, or good or bad usability, accessibility. All these different terms that we talk about in IST 250 are becoming more and more important really as time goes on. 10 years ago or so, we'd build websites and say, well, I hope they work well for those people out there. We really didn't do much cross-browser testing, which is another term we'll talk about in class. There certainly was not nearly the number of mobile devices. I think the only people who had tablets were on Star Trek. The web landscape yearly, if not monthly anymore, becomes more and more complex. Usability, these considerations of the end user and their experience, their interaction, the story we want them to walk through as they're using the products that we build, is just growing exponentially. So we have to be considerate of the end user for a lot of different reasons, and so we'll talk about that in class as well. But this sort of it sort of becomes a field in itself, really. Web usability. So again, just a very complex field is web development, and so we try to touch on each of these important areas where you could certainly focus an entire career, in any of these areas. This is the complexity of an ecosystem. That's more on that term, the sustainable web ecosystem. So we include the user as a big part of that ecosystem, obviously. So it brings up the question, where does one node of the system start and another end? The important thing here is to see and understand these layers of our mobile computing vegetation, right? Like all these different nodes and areas, these layers, all these different modules that are interacting with each other, playing off each other. And so when we're talking about code, we certainly need to be looking at primarily the code that you need, right? So no one person is going to be working with all of these layers of code. You'll in this class we talk about the higher level, or I shouldn't really call them the higher level. And here we talk about more about markup languages, this top layer, the markup language, and the CSS, obviously, but it's good to have this sort of greater context around the rest of these layers that are going on. But you certainly the average professional certainly wouldn't be specializing in all of these by any means. So but it's just good to have this sort of contextual understanding of how complex this ecosystem is, this web ecosystem that we talk about, and then go from there. Okay, so as a wrap-up, this has been sort of a mile-high view of the different layers, the different types of code that one might come across when building web systems, web applications, websites. What we will be focusing on in this class, IST 250, is shown here. Sort of the markup languages layer, not including Cold Fusion. We won't be doing any Cold Fusion in this class, but we will be doing HTML, particularly HTML5, which is the newest version of HTML. We'll take a look at XML just to give you an idea of what XML is, how it can be used, why it's valuable. And then, of course, to style our pages to make them fancy and interesting, visually appealing, and some other things, some other good reasons to use it. We'll take a look at CSS for a couple weeks and get everybody some experience understanding the structure of CSS declarations, how they're used, and some best practices. And then it'll set you off and running so you can become CSS and HTML experts. We'll also look at a lot of other things this semester, but this should give you some good context on what we'll be doing and how it falls into this other larger context called the layers of code for the web. So, as always, let me know if you have any questions on any of this, and I will see you in class soon.